afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the London Art Fair. I'm Simon Martin, and I'm the curator of Pallant House Gallery in Chichester. And of course, we're all here today to mark the launch of the new monograph on Jeremy Gardiner, which has been published by Lund Humphreys. And I think you can all see the copy here. And of course, around the room, we have a variety of paintings and works on paper and a couple of prints by Jeremy. So we'll start, you can see the book jacket behind us, and so I think it would be good just to have a look at that work in full scale without the crop, and you get a sense of Jeremy's kind of panoramic view of the landscape, and that was actually the title of the show that we had in Pallant House Gallery in 2010 in the spring, and we presented Jeremy's work alongside a show of the St Ives artists and the British modernist Tunnard. And in many ways, I think Jeremy's work presents a different notion of the landscape, a much more contemporary updating of the work of those artists. And it looks at time and the landscape. And perhaps we can start, Jeremy, by asking you a little bit about your notion of recent contemporary time and deep time, because I think that's really what's present in your work.
Well, I'm fascinated by the geology of landscape and the way it's shaped by the forces of nature. Unfolding the landscape through the painting I'm making is really about inviting the viewer to consider their relationship with the physical world. I've been painting the southern coast of England for about 30 years now, and been looking at it from many different perspectives, walking the coast, riding it on my bicycle. I've been looking at it from out at sea in a boat, and more recently from up in the air in a small Cessna aeroplane. And I guess that interest and adventurous spirit has led me to examine other places like the archipelago of Fernando de Noronha in Brazil and the island of Milos in Greece. So I'm trying to understand the book of time, if you like, from the Jurassic coast to these other areas in the world, trying to turn those pages and get a sense of how the world was formed, how it was made. But it is England that stirs my imagination the most, and I'm constantly drawn back to Dorset, Cornwall and the Lake District.
So the very structure and kind of makeup of your work, that your process of working could be said to be akin to a kind of geological process. Now, this work is painted on board, but the processes are both a kind of accretion, rather like kind of sedimentary rock forms, but also a kind of mining into the surface in a way. The way that perhaps you could talk a little bit about, first of all, the use of the boards that you use and how you see this in relation to geology.
Well, the panel that Simon's referring to and the pictures that are actually hanging on the wall in this space are all painted on poplar panel. It's very light and robust plywood. So intrinsically the plywood already has a strata built into it. And when I'm working in the studio, I'm cutting the shapes of the boards that I'll carry with me into the landscape. So I'm working plein air. The pictures are produced over a number of months, sometimes years, as I take them out again and again into the landscape to the same place. So I'm recording in paint, laminating in paint on top of the poplar, working with acrylic and a casting medium called jesmonite. I'm laminating layers of imagery together. So I might visit, in this instance, Clavell Tower on numerous occasions, different times of year, paint a picture, and I'll bring it back out again and paint a new picture, maybe from a slightly different vantage point, trying to capture the atmosphere of that particular day, and then I'll sand back through that information in the studio, revealing pastime another, another time of year, perhaps the year before. And all those composites of time are trying to, all those intermingling experiences make an appearance in the finished picture.
Moving forward, this is about 10 years later. I mean, this is after Jeremy returned from, actually, whilst you were still in Miami when
Yeah,
you
I was still
painted
working in
this.
the States.
But it's a return to English subject matter in Dorset, and the structure, I think, is very clear that with the direction that Jeremy was moving at this point.
Yeah, well, you're right, it was painted in Miami. I mean, I lived in Miami for 5 years. I was teaching at the New World School of the Arts, and a very barren landscape, very flat, 1 metre above sea level, South Florida. And I was pining for the English landscape, and I'd make numerous trips back to England on painting expeditions. And this picture is called Ballad Down. It's Swanage Bay, essentially. You've got there's a black sea, and the headland that you can see in the middle distance is Ballad Point. It was a precursor to 16 paintings that I went on to make in Paul Nash's old studio on the seafront in Swanage, which we'll see in a moment. Yeah.
And the patterner, I think that a lot of your more recent paintings have a similar kind of patterner, but I think there's a very interesting starting point for the patterner in these works, which has like a nautical.
Yeah. Well, working in Miami, I had a studio in Coconut Grove, in what was the old Pan Am buildings, and all the wrecks from Hurricane Andrew were stored there. So with Marina, my daughter, and my son, we used to salvage and scavenge all the repurposed hardwoods from the wrecks and take them into the studio. So all of these elements that you can see in this particular painting are fragments from those wrecks. But I think the pattern, as Simon's referring to, is the interest I have in boatyards. Aside from Coconut Grove, I spend a lot of time at Cobb Quay and Poole and watch the shipwrights at work there when they're fixing the hulls of the boats. And the colours and structures as they're perhaps plugging a hole or sanding a hull, the contrast between the yacht varnish above the sea line on the boat and the weathered surface of the hulls below always interests me. And I think some of those surfaces are finding their way into the pictures. This is one of 16 panels. It's Swanage Bay. I'm working from a very enclosed space, number 2 the Parade. It's a very small flat that Nash had in 1935. He'd rented this flat on the Victorian, which is a Victorian terrace on the seafront in Swanage, and I was able to rent that in the early 90s, on and off. And so I was working from a very dark, enclosed space, looking out into this vast expanse of sea and sky. So there were elements that appeared in the pictures. This particular instance is a still life, so you can see the belly of a jug. You've got a cliff-top horizon. There is a small boat in the bay. All these small elements helping to dictate the space, the pictorial space in the picture. And obviously it's referencing that grand tradition of post-war British art from St Ives.
Moving forward to Durdle Door and Ammonites, we actually not only do we have the depiction of the landscape, and there is this tension between abstraction, the kind of topography, and the physical presence of the past, and this use of jesmonite, and jesmonite is a casting kind of almost used for archaeological, geological kind of casting, and the ammonite here makes a very strong statement about the past on this coastline.
Yeah. Again, what's interesting about this Dorset coastline, the Jurassic coast, is that it's, unbelievable forces have heaved up vast cliffs into vertical orientations. It all happened about 70 million years ago with the creation of the Alps. But in this case, with the Astericus, I'm being very particular about the kind of ammonite it is, because geologists use them as a way to age rock. There are many different kinds of ammonites. But I had an opportunity to work at the Dorset County Museum with their collection of fossils, funded by the Arts Council. And that enabled me to find very particular fossils from different places along the coast. Some that had been found 100 years ago, they were all in cardboard boxes with tiny labels, with copperplate handwriting, mentioning the day they were found, who found them. And I've been able to make casts of a number of these.
That sense of panorama, I think, is particularly strong in Chapman's pool here, which again features the fossil. There's almost a sense of musical notation, I think, with these particularly kind of stretched out panoramas.
Very close to this spot there's a stone bench, and carved into the stone bench is the phrase "time passes." Listen, time passes, which is from Dylan Thomas's Under Milkwood, which is a play for voices. And I think that it's very pertinent to mention that at this juncture. So that's a 3 metre long panel, panoramic in format. I'm borrowing from a 19th century tradition of panoramic paintings that were a form of entertainment. It's 50 mil deep, it's about 5 centimetres thick, and it looks at a section of Chapman's Pool, a cast fossil, and I'm trying to distill the atmosphere of place through the use of light, space and colour.
Sweeping through a couple of paintings of the Cornish mines. This is the Levant Cliffs, which is actually something that, again, it's this post-industrial landscape, these former tin mines, which you can see on the left-hand side. And here, this is Wheel Coats. These wonderful kind of oxidized rocks, and the sense of the colour of Cornish tin mines coming through here. But I wanted just to look at your printmaking, and
they're intaglio monoprints, which is a very painterly form of printmaking. They're unique prints. They're panoramic in format. They're about 2 metres in length. They're composed of a multitude of different plates. I'm trying to create an atmosphere of antiquity in these pictures by using different textured plates. So I'm always finding fragments of discarded metal that I can use to print with. You've got these very almost scientific illustrations of the fossils. So I like to think of these prints like musical scores. If I'm taking a walk, 1 minute I might be looking at the texture of the lichen on a rock, another minute at the colour of the sky, and then another case looking at a fossil embedded in a piece of Purbeck limestone. So they're very much, they're not single views, they're composite views. But this is a new form of printmaking that I've been exploring. It's additive printmaking. It's working with, if you can imagine, it's almost like a three-dimensional Xerox machine. So it's additive fabrication. So that LiDAR data, the data I'm using in some of the monoprints, essentially is captured by aeroplanes flying over the landscape. They use pulses of laser to set the height and elevation data for the landscapes, and I'm taking that data and I'm able to build a model like that using it. So we're looking at St Aldham's Head. You can't make it out, but actually there's a tiny Norman chapel on the tip of St Aldham's Head. There's a small row of Coast Guard cottages. Anthony Caro lives in one of them. And I wanted to make this miniature world of one of the places where I work. And the reason it's in a globe is because I feel it's a landscape that needs to be protected. It's sure the dome relief print is a reference for me in the studio, but also I'm trying to give a spectator a sense of something that has to be looked after.
How do you see your work? This is just finishing here with a couple of Jeremy's paintings of Cumbria, waterfalls in Cumbria, and that sense of ecology and the changing atmosphere and the pressures on the earth. I think your work is very relevant to that. And how would you see your work in relation to that exploration of those issues?
Well, I mean, this particular project, Simon, took place at Nottingham University, and I was working in the geography department, and was walking the Lake District with a geographer called Gary Priestnell, who was an expert on the lakes. I'd never visited the Lake District before, so I began to find out about it. Now, again, it's really an interest in erosion and time. The Lake Districts, or the lakes that we're familiar with today, were formed 450 million years ago during cataclysmic eruptions. That's when the volcanoes happened. During the last ice age, not very long ago, 25,000 to 10,000 years ago, the glaciers in the lakes carved the valleys. When that ice receded about 10,000 years ago, the valleys filled with water, and they created the lakes that we're familiar with today. But I decided to focus on the waterfalls. There are 4 different kinds of waterfalls, and essentially they're these incredible machines for erosion. I focused on cascade waterfalls, which are linked waterfalls. And if you can imagine, think of a waterfall as a machine that's cutting through stone. In the space of 15,000 years, a cascade waterfall like this one at Stockgill Force will cut through 400 metres of rock. That's about 2 centimetres a year. So just looking at these waterfalls for a short period of time and wanting to paint them, I thought was a very simple way to distill the process of erosion that we're experiencing on our coastlines and with rising sea levels at the moment. But I chose waterfalls as the subject.
The use of the word distillation, I think, is very appropriate, I think, to your work in terms of what you draw out of the landscape, and I think it's really been very fascinating. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.